Welcome to a quiet space in a very loud world. If you are tuning in tonight, I am guessing you are trying to make sense of the constant noise out there. Let us just look at the math and the realities of where we are right now in May 2026. We are surrounded by daily headlines, political turbulence, unprecedented legal maneuvers, and sudden institutional panics. I remember when I was younger, looking at the daily news tickers, thinking I had to react to every single institutional conflict to protect my money. I felt like an absolute genius for about 3 weeks, until the market reminded me that I was just an amateur getting a very expensive lesson. That was the day I realized that true financial peace is built on the most unglamorous, predictable, and almost painfully boring truths. Let us pull back the curtain on how the world is shifting tonight, and let us examine the structural realities beneath the hype. Right now, the collective conversation is completely dominated by massive institutional maneuvers, capital allocation debates, and unprecedented legal actions at the highest levels of governance. We see massive headlines detailing an extraordinary situation where a sitting chief executive is attempting to settle a massive $10 billion lawsuit originally filed against an internal revenue agency under his own executive branch. The report suggests that negotiations are underway to drop the multi-billion-dollar claim in exchange for the creation of a centralized $1.776 billion compensation fund. The narrative suggests this fund would possess total authority to distribute massive taxpayer resources to a specific group of political allies, individuals involved in historical capital events, and potentially entities connected to the executive family itself. When a narrative like this hits the mainstream media, the immediate reaction of the crowd is profound moral panic, political urgency, and defensive financial positioning. People look at the scale of a $1.8 billion fund, the lack of traditional congressional oversight, and they immediately anticipate massive systemic corruption. They begin to buy high-priced hedges, they dump their liquid assets, and they make drastic changes to their personal investments out of pure emotional reaction to the political theater. But if we step away from the television screens and look at this through the lens of pure structural mechanics and constitutional mathematics, the illusion of chaotic omnipotence begins to fade. Let us look at the cold, hard baseline of our legal and economic infrastructure, which operates on structural rules that are surprisingly rigid. A deep analysis of the ongoing litigation in the Southern District of Florida reveals that the system has built-in frictions that cannot be bypassed by simple executive desire. The presiding federal judge has raised a fundamental question regarding subject matter jurisdiction, rooted deeply in Article 3 of the United States Constitution. The mathematical and logical rules of Article 3 constrain federal courts to adjudicate only actual cases or controversies, which strictly requires two genuinely adverse litigants. The historical precedent established by the highest courts dictates that judicial power does not extend to the academic pastime of rendering judgments in favor of persons against themselves, even when an individual sues an agency in a personal capacity while simultaneously controlling that agency in an official capacity. The lack of true structural adversity remains a fatal flaw to navigate this novel scenario. The court took the deliberate step of appointing outside legal experts known as amici curiae to provide an independent structural analysis. These independent examiners recently submitted a comprehensive brief recommending a rigorous fact-finding inquiry into the potential collusion between the Executive Office and the Revenue Agency. They noted that the Treasury Secretary and the Internal Revenue Commissioner serve at the absolute will of the President, meaning the executive branch maintains extraordinary internal control over both sides of the lawsuit. Furthermore, the chief executive has publicly stated his belief that he is supposed to work out a settlement with himself, providing direct evidence of a lack of institutional adversity. When you analyze these structural frictions calmly, you realize that the headline narrative of an immediate, unstoppable multi-billion-dollar wealth transfer is highly inaccurate. The system possesses deep, predictable layers of procedural defense, including Privacy Act limitations, traceable damage requirements, and clear statutes of limitations that restrict historical claims. The independent brief points out that even if the case somehow survives the initial jurisdictional hurdle, the claims face multiple levels of legal invalidity. I lay out these structural facts not to engage in political commentary, but because true preservation of capital requires you to be absolutely brutal with your assumptions about power and markets. The mainstream financial world loves a crisis narrative because volatility generates transaction volume, and volume generates massive fees for Wall Street institutions. They want you to look at a headline about a $2 billion political fund and assume that the entire rule of law has collapsed, so that you panic sell your quality assets and buy speculative instruments. But the ultimate rebellion against a chaotic news cycle is to remain completely steady and trust the structural math of the economy. True financial defense does not come from trying to guess the outcome of federal court orders or front-running institutional scandals. It comes from knowing the exact margin of safety in your personal asset allocation when you look past the political anxiety and calculate the actual wealth generation of global businesses. You realize that companies building consumer essentials, providing energy, or dominating technology do not stop compounding because of an institutional dispute in Washington. My approach to these situations is always to look past the dramatic headlines and focus entirely on the unyielding mathematics of compounding assets. Think about what happens to the average retail investor who constantly adjusts their portfolio based on the breaking news cycle. They see a headline about an executive settlement, they panic, they liquidate their long-term index funds, they incur unnecessary capital gains taxes, and they hide in cash or low-yield instruments. Then, the structural guardrails of the court system quietly do their job. The lawsuit is dismissed for lack of jurisdiction, the panic subsides, and the market rips to new all-time highs. The frantic investor has successfully locked in a permanent loss of purchasing power and missed out on the wealth generation of the global economy. They vastly overestimate the short-term impact of a single political headline, but they completely underestimate the monumental wealth that is built through 5 years of doing absolutely nothing. Let us look at the real math of building an unshakable foundation, the kind that allows you to sleep peacefully regardless of who sits in the executive branch or what lawsuits are filed. When you have your first $100,000 anchored in passive, highly liquid index funds that track the total productivity of human enterprise, your baseline relationship with external fear completely changes. You no longer view global events through the frantic lens of personal financial survival. You have runway, you have optionality, and you have the luxury of time. If you automate your index fund contributions every single 2 weeks, you are engaging in dollar cost averaging, which is the most anti-fragile financial strategy ever devised. When institutional fear drives the equity markets down, your automated contribution simply buys more shares of great companies at a significant discount. When the political panic inevitably passes and the market recovers, your existing shares appreciate in value. The mathematics of diversification win in every single scenario, provided you have the emotional discipline to stay out of the way. We also need to look at our domestic tax structures as we navigate the current year of 2026. Maximizing your tax-advantaged accounts, like contributing up to the $7,500 limit for a Roth IRA, is a mathematical certainty that builds true defense. It is a legally guaranteed way to shelter your future compounding growth from institutional shifts, ensuring that the wealth you build today remains entirely yours decades down the road. The modern world is intentionally designed to keep you in a state of perpetual urgency, making you feel like you are missing out on a trend or that your wealth is constantly under threat. They want you to view your personal finance as a high-stakes game of speed, prediction, and constant adjustment. But real wealth is built on the most boring, repetitive, and unglamorous habits imaginable. It is the act of spending less than you earn month after month, year after year, and placing the surplus into productive engines that require zero daily management. We cannot control what happens in the Southern District of Florida. We cannot control how regulatory bodies conduct their internal settlement discussions. And we cannot control the political theater of the day, but we have total and absolute control over our personal balance sheet. We can choose to eliminate high-interest consumer debt with a brutal ferocity, knowing that a guaranteed interest savings is the highest risk-free return we will ever find. We can choose to build an emergency fund that can sustain our lives for 6 months, giving us the structural strength to ignore short-term economic and political turbulence. And we can choose to look at the daily news with a sense of calm, analytical detachment, understanding that headlines are designed to capture attention, while numbers are designed to capture truth. Let us transition our focus to another massive trend that is capturing the attention of the entire financial world, the massive movement around critical minerals and national security. We see a huge narrative right now regarding the industrial competition between major global superpowers over rare earth elements and processing supply chains. The underlying math tells us that a single nation currently controls about 70% of the world mining capacity and close to 90% of the processing infrastructure for these materials. This creates a massive structural bottleneck for defense systems, advanced electronics, and electric vehicles. When we look at newer companies trying to build domestic supply chains in regions like West Texas or Oklahoma, we are looking at a heavy narrative play backed by significant government capital. In fact, the government involvement often includes massive federal support packages, including millions of shares, warrants, and hundreds of millions of dollars in technology grants. If you look at this through the lens of pure mathematics, you must realize that heavy industrial projects are transitionally slow, capital-intensive, and highly dilutive to early investors. The market often prices in the grand narrative of national security long before a single ounce of material is commercially processed. My approach to these situations is always to look past the political speeches and calculate the actual cost of production and the true timeline of execution. True defense in your portfolio does not come from chasing geopolitical anxiety. It comes from knowing the exact margin of safety in your assets. Then we look at the explosive growth of specialized cloud infrastructure, what the market likes to call specialized artificial intelligence compute networks. We see massive commitments, including multi-billion-dollar deals stretching over the next decade, backed by heavy equity investments from major technology leaders. Even the largest global chip makers are stepping in with billions of dollars to guarantee manufacturing capacity, leading to a massive pipeline of signed enterprise contracts. When you hear these astronomical numbers, it is incredibly easy to get swept up in the excitement of an infinite technology. Boom. But as someone who prefers the boring certainty of basic business math, I have to remind myself that high concentration of revenue is a critical structural vulnerability. If 2 or 3 major corporate clients decide to scale back their capital expenditure, those data centers suddenly become very expensive warehouses. I do not look at these infrastructure plays as a guaranteed ticket to wealth. I look at them as highly cyclical businesses currently operating at peak momentum. If you want to build a portfolio that survives decades, you cannot afford to buy assets when their narrative is completely flawless and priced to absolute perfection. You wait for the inevitable cyclical cooling, you preserve your cash reserves, and you buy the infrastructure when the rest of the market is panicking about short-term growth slowdowns. We also see this exact same structural shift happening in the digital asset infrastructure space. Right now, certain segments of that market are experiencing a severe downturn, with many digital assets sitting in a prolonged quiet cycle because of this current market condition. Corporate entities that built vast power networks for mining are aggressively pivoting their operations into artificial intelligence computing. We are seeing massive partnerships emerge to construct gigawatts of electrical capacity, with plans to scale significantly over the next few years. The market often treats these transitioning companies with extreme skepticism because of their historical ties to volatile digital assets. But if you look at the physical reality, a gigawatt of power, heavy-duty cooling systems, and fiber optic connections have intrinsic value regardless of what specific software is running on the servers. This is where the concept of deep structural value comes into play when a stock is discounted due to general market exhaustion, but its underlying physical infrastructure is desperately needed by a booming industry. You find a structural asymmetry, it is a boring, unglamorous calculation. But finding mispriced industrial capacity is how you protect your downside while leaving the door open for compounding growth. Let us move our eyes over to the energy sector, because this is where the entire future of technology will either succeed or break down. The massive computing clusters we are building require an astronomical amount of electricity, and they require it to be online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Solar and wind are beautiful concepts, but they suffer from natural intermittency, and traditional natural gas plants face multi-year permitting delays. This has forced the largest technology companies in the world to sign massive nuclear power agreements, including reviving dormant plants or locking up gigawatts of nuclear capacity. The small modular reactor space is highly watched because traditional large-scale reactors cost over $20 billion and take over a decade to construct. Factory-built modules that generate specific megawatt outputs, which can be clustered to produce significant utility power, represent a fundamental shift in industrial design. The first movers in this space spent over a decade and tens of millions of dollars just to secure design approval from federal regulators, creating a massive regulatory moat. Furthermore, there is a growing narrative connecting this modular nuclear technology to the broader space economy and future exploration milestones. But as a conservative allocator of capital, I have to look at the cold chronology of corporate guidance. The first commercial modular reactors are not scheduled to be online until the end of this decade. That means for the next several years, any investment in this space is purely a bet on a narrative and a sequence of regulatory milestones. It does not generate free cash flow today, and it cannot buy back its own shares. If you choose to allocate capital here, you must categorize it correctly. It is a speculative venture wrapped in a structural macroeconomic tailwind. Never confuse a compelling long-term story with a stable wealth-building anchor. Now let us transition into a completely different arena. The clinical biotech sector, which represents one of the highest risk quadrants in the entire financial universe. We can examine a specific case study, such as a company operating with a highly specific differentiated thesis in the multiple sclerosis therapeutic market. The global valuation for this therapeutic space is projected to exceed $38 billion by 2030. The traditional approach for decades has been immunomodulation, which means suppressing the immune system to slow down the stripping of the protective myelin sheath around nerve fibers. The alternative approach being tested is non-immunomodulatory, aiming to inhibit demyelination directly and protect the myelin itself. In preclinical models, these specific entities demonstrated structural preservation, and an investigational new drug filing was announced recently, alongside this medical asset. Companies often hold equity stakes in consumer assets focused on alcohol metabolism technology, which publish clinical studies to capture retail interest. They maintain complex royalty structures where payments stand at high percentages until cumulative caps are met before dropping to lower percentages in perpetuity. To add to the complexity, there are often active legal claims seeking massive damages regarding historical market manipulation allegations. If you look at this entire structure, it sounds like an incredibly dynamic corporate narrative, but let us apply our strict financial discipline to these numbers. The medical asset is often pre-phase 2. Phase 1 only proved that the compound does not harm healthy volunteers. It proved absolutely zero about whether it cures or treats actual human patients. The historical failure rate for drugs transitioning from preclinical success to human efficacy is staggeringly high. Any negative data readout in the coming months would immediately devalue the core thesis. The consumer royalty is dependent on a completely separate management team executing a commercial launch. And massive lawsuits can take years to resolve through discovery with no guarantee of a favorable judgment. Biotech is an environment where capital is consumed rapidly, and dilution is a constant risk for early retail investors. I lay out these facts not to be a cynic, but because true preservation of capital requires you to be absolutely brutal with your assumptions. When you look at small-cap clinical biotechs, you are not investing in a predictable mathematical engine, you are placing a wager on a highly volatile binary outcome, building real wealth. The kind that allows you to sleep peacefully through economic cycles is never about finding the one microcap stock that goes up 20-fold. It is about building an unshakable foundation through consistent, automated allocation into broad market realities when you have your first $100,000 anchored in passive, highly liquid index funds that track the total productivity of human enterprise. Your baseline relationship with reality changes. You no longer view the world through the frantic lens of trying to escape financial pressure. You have runway, you have optionality, and you have the luxury of time. The modern financial world is designed to keep you in a state of perpetual urgency, making you feel like you are missing out on every single tech boom, mining contract, or medical breakthrough. They want you to trade frequently, borrow aggressively, and view your finances as a high-stakes game, but the ultimate rebellion against a chaotic system is to be completely steady. You automate your index fund contributions, you maximize your tax-advantaged accounts like a Roth IRA up to its legal limit, you avoid high-interest consumer debt like a plague, and you let the simple math of compounding do the heavy lifting over a 5 to 10 year horizon. We often vastly overestimate what we can accomplish in a single week of frantic trading, but we completely underestimate the monumental wealth that is built through 5 years of quiet, uninterrupted discipline. Let us choose the boring clarity of numbers over the emotional exhaustion of speculative hype. Thank you for spending a part of your night with me in this quiet space. Keep your head down, protect your capital, and let the math work for you. Good night, and stay safe out there.